So welcome everyone. My name is Nikki Lefebvre. I'm the Executive Director of the Natick Historical Society. We've been around since 1870, and today we remain an independent nonprofit, and we thrive on the support of our community. So thank you very much to all of our supporters who help make programs and exhibits like the one we're going to be talking about today, make them possible. So I am really delighted to be here this afternoon with my colleague, Gail Coughlin. She is our volunteer and research manager. But before I introduce Gail properly, I do want to highlight a few upcoming events, one of which in fact also features Gail's wonderful work. So some of you may have joined us for the first lecture in our series, Indigenous Histories and Futures in Natick, Massachusetts, with Professor Daniel Mandel. If you missed that lecture, you can check it out now. We have just posted a recording of it on our YouTube channel. So you won't want to miss that. And if you haven't registered for the next events in that series, then I encourage you to do so. We will have Professor Jean O'Brien speaking on firsting and lasting, writing Indians out of existence in New England on October 19th. And then jumping ahead to December 14th, we'll have Nipmuc tribal historian and genealogist Pamela Ellis with us, and she'll be speaking on Indigenous Natick today. You can register for both of those events via our website. And I want to thank, again, the Bridge Street Initiative of Mass Humanities for making that lecture series possible. On Saturday, October 8th, our very own Gail Coughlin will also be giving an outdoor in-person talk on Natick in the King Philip's War, and looking at some of folks here today. I know some of you have done that. If you haven't yet had a chance to join Gail for that program, I absolutely encourage you to do so. There are a few spots left. And finally, I want to mention that the first event in our Meet Our Neighbors series is coming up this Wednesday night at 7 o'clock in the evening. It will feature David Parrish and Amy Sagkin of the Bacon Free Library, and you can register for that on our website as well. All of our programming is free and open to the public. Gail, our special guest for this afternoon, we're so excited to have you. Gail, as I mentioned, is the research and volunteer manager here at the Natick Historical Society. She holds an MA in history from UMass Amherst, where she specialized in 17th century Indigenous histories. Her master's thesis, quote, "Our souls are already cared for, Indigenous reactions to religious colonialism in 17th century New England and New France and New Mexico," end quote, analyzes the experiences of Indigenous residents of Christian mission communities, throughout North America, including Natick. As an independent scholar, Gail has also contributed to the Omohundro Institute's Ben Franklin's World podcast, another great program, check it out, as well as a wide variety of projects at the Dedham Historical Society and Museum. And on a more personal note, Gail has contributed just immeasurably to our work here at the Natick Historical Society, and we couldn't be more grateful to have her on our teams. Though silent, welcome. Thank you so much, Gail, for being with us.
Well, thank you, Nikki, and thank you for that very lovely introduction, and thank you to everybody for coming and missing the Patriots game. And I see that there are a few people from Dedham here who are missing Dedham Day, so thank you all for being here. So to begin, I think a really important question to ask is why create an exhibit about 18th century land deeds and documents? The Natick Historical Society displayed a land deed from 1760 in their exhibit across the century, looking at local objects. As described in the deed, Leah Chalcombe, Esther Sudak, and Hepzibeth Pegan, who inherited their proprietorship rights from their ancestor Solomon Thomas, sold 31 acres of land to Ephraim Bacon, an Englishman originally from Dedham. This deed highlights an important moment in Natick's history, but viewed alone can only tell us so much. Through this exhibit, I want to put this deed in conversation with other documents from our collection. Together, these documents give a fuller, albeit still incomplete picture of the people, places, and complex political and social dynamics that defined Natick during the 18th century. I thought it was essential to pull in the Morse Institute Library, as they also have relevant documents that would enrich this exhibit. This exhibit also grew out of the general interest permeating Natick about the town's early history, especially concerning the experiences of early Indigenous residents, who are often referred to as praying Indians. I wanted to create this exhibit to highlight Indigenous affairs in the 18th century. I found this especially important due to the popularity of Dr. Jean M. O'Brien's book, Dispossession by Degree. Content aside, I also wanted to find a way to ensure that archival records from the Natick Historical Society and the Morse Institute Library were accessible to the general public. Not everybody interested in 18th century New England can easily get to Natick. Secondly, the exhibit provides a glimpse of what the NHS and MIL have in their collections. I think it's particularly important that Nipmuc and Massachusetts people have access to documents that pertain to their ancestors and could inform contemporary understandings of land. So now I think it's important that we head over to the actual exhibit and check that out. So when you first open the front page of the exhibit, you will see the introduction. Here you'll be able to read a brief overview of the exhibit's content and goals. Additionally, I provide suggestions on how to use it in conjunction with other sources. And I also include instructions to navigate the exhibit. So I think I'll kind of go through and explain the best ways to navigate the exhibit. If you direct your attention to the right-hand side of the screen, so over here, if you can see my cursor, hopefully, you will see the exhibit menu. You can click on the section you would like to go to next. For instance, timeline and context. You can also move to the next section or back to the previous section by clicking the navigation buttons on the bottom of your screen. So when you first click something on the menu, you will be taken to the top of the screen. You can go down, read all the information, look at all the images, and then you can navigate back using these buttons down here. So I'll go back to the introduction. If you want to zoom in on an image, first click on the image itself. You'll be taken to the photo's object page that includes a description and its Dublin core and citation information. So Dublin core, I should specify, it's really just a system of organizing metadata. So like it's the 15 most important pieces of metadata about an object or an image. And if you scroll down a little bit more, you can click on the image again. It will load. Still loading. Here it is. Slowly but surely, it will come up. All right, and then you can click on it again after it's done completely loading, which is great. There, so you can click on it again. It will zoom in really close. You don't really have much control over the amount of zoom you would like, but it zooms in and you can move it around to see more details. So to get back to the exhibit, you have to click on the back button twice. And I think it's really important to note that when you click on an image, it won't open into a new tab. You always have to click the back button. And this exhibit contains 7 sections. So we have introduction, which I've already described, timeline and context, which includes a timeline and narrative overview of 18th century Natick, which describes like the land system and how that changed over the century. Next, there's document analysis. So this describes the different types of documents that you'll see in the exhibit. So there are multiple different types of land deeds, which is kind of the main focus of the exhibit. And I just define every type of land deed that is featured in the exhibit, and you'll be able to see how they kind of differ or are similar to one another. Next, we have the collection itself. So here you can see all of the deeds and documents from our collections, the Natick Historical Society and Morse Institute Library. So you can see that they've been categorized by the type of deed that they are, which I defined in the document analysis. And if you go to the bottom here, there are a lot of deeds. You can see that we have some surveyor's maps as well. So these kind of go hand in hand with a lot of the deeds. So you can better see how the land divisions were laid out within the town. Next, we have the collection's history. So this describes how the documents came to the Natick Historical Society and Morse Institute Library, and gives an overview of these documents as physical objects. So it doesn't go into the content of the documents, but it describes how they came to our collections, and it describes how they've been preserved up until now. Sources and further reading contains a bibliography of the sources I used to write the exhibit, and I would recommend all of these as really important sources that you might want to use in conjunction with looking through the exhibit. They all contain really great background analysis. And finally, we have credits and acknowledgements, in which I include my biography and a note of thanks to Jen Belcher and Skylar Selden from the Morse Institute Library for all of their help in creating this exhibit. And I made sure that all of the information within the exhibit is as easy to find as possible. So there are a couple ways to find information. So let me find a deed, and I will show you that I have tagged all of the names of the people who are mentioned in the document. So if you want to see everything that mentions Hezekiah Broad, you can just click on the tag, and you can see all of the deeds in which Hezekiah Broad is mentioned. And I should just tell you that Hezekiah Broad is mentioned in most of these deeds. And another way to find information about a specific person is through searching. So a name that might appear often in these deeds is Bacon, because the Bacon family was very prominent in 18th century Natick. So you will see here all of the deeds that mention a member of the Bacon family. So I want to go back now and kind of explain what we can really learn from these deeds. So what can we learn from just reading a single deed? And I think the best way to do this is to read you a short excerpt, and I'll mention that this is a short excerpt. It might not sound short, but it is, from the overall deed. So I will begin. The receipt whereof I, John George, do hereby acknowledge, and myself therewith, fully satisfied and contented in thereof, and every part and parcel thereof, do exonerate, acquit, and discharge him, the said Abraham Speen, and his heirs, executors and administrators, forever by these presents, have given, granted, bargained, sold, aliened, conveyed, and confirmed by these presents, do freely, fully, and absolutely give, grant, bargain, sell, alien, convey, and confirm unto him, the said Abraham Speen, and to his heirs and assigns forever, one certain tract or parcel of land lying in Natick aforesaid, containing 4 acres, budded and bounded as follows: beginning at a red or gray oak tree marked with stones about it, on the southeast corner of said land, which is bound marked between land of Hezekiah Broad of said land, bordering on said Broad's land northwesterly to a stake and stones, thence turning and running southwesterly on land of said George to another stake and stone, which is bounds between said land and land belonging to Mary Sudak, so called. Thence near or quite on the same point still on said Sudak's land to another stake and stone, thence turning and running southeasterly to a red oak tree marked on a straight line, thence turning more south and running to an apple tree marked, thence on a straight line to the bounds first mentioned, and another tract or parcel of meadow, lying in the great meadow so called, containing 2 acres, budded and bounded as follows. Bounded westerly on meadow of said Abraham Speen, northward on land or meadow of Oliver Peabody, eastward and southward on or near land or meadow of said Peabody, unless at the southward corner it bounds on land or meadow of Joseph Ephraim, or however otherwise bounded. So that's just a short excerpt of one of the many deeds in this collection. So what does this mean and what can we learn from it? So most immediately, this deed functioned as a receipt. It states that John George, an indigenous farmer from Natick, received 11 pounds in public credit from Abraham Speen, also an indigenous farmer from Natick, in exchange for 2 parcels of land. The deed also describes the boundaries of Speen's newly purchased land in proximity to the properties of his male and female, indigenous and English neighbors. Perhaps most importantly, the deed acted as a legal and permanent transfer of land, guaranteeing Abraham Speen and his descendants ownership and right to the land forever. This deed introduces 21st century readers to some of the complexities of the land system in 18th century Natick. In 1719, Natick Town Meeting, made up entirely of Indigenous members, adopted an English-style proprietorship system, and for the first time in the community's almost 70-year history, Indigenous peoples owned private parcels of land. Residents previously held the community's land in common. Only descendants of Natick's founding families, such as the Speen family, became proprietors with the right to buy and sell land. Their descendants inherited those rights. Both men, such as Joseph Ephraim, and women, such as Mary Sudak, who are both mentioned in this deed, became proprietors. Through this deed, we learn the names of some of these proprietors and see a snapshot of where they lived and how they bounded their properties. Proprietors had the right to sell land to English settlers, and increasingly over the 18th century, English settlers moved to Natick, often due to ministerial taxes and population growth in English towns. This deed contains the names of some of those settlers, such as Oliver Peabody, the minister assigned to preach in Natick from the 1720s until his death in 1752. And Hezekiah Broad's property is also mentioned. Hezekiah Broad and his descendants purchased a significant amount of land in Natick during the 18th century. English women also played particular roles in the Natick land system. They owned land. Children could inherit their mother's estate, and as demonstrated in this 1739 deed, if you read the whole thing, women such as Hannah Peabody, the wife of Reverend Oliver Peabody, acted as witnesses to land sale. And what can we begin to learn from viewing these documents together as an exhibit? Although this deed can begin to tell us a lot, it cannot tell us everything about Natick during the 18th century. To learn more about the complex systems governing and influencing land ownership in the 18th century, it is crucial to view this deed within a larger collection. When Indigenous proprietors sold land to English settlers, they needed approval from the Massachusetts General Court due to a 17th century law. Their guardians, a group of Englishmen appointed to oversee all aspects of Indigenous finances, also needed to approve the sale. Although the Massachusetts General Court argued that the policies protected Indigenous peoples from English encroachment onto their land, the law and guardianship system regulated Indigenous lives and land according to colonial norms. These systems also acted on the harmful presumption of later allotment policies throughout America that Indigenous peoples were not competent enough to manage their land or finances. Guardianship and colonial land laws increasingly impacted Natick during the 1740s and later, as more Indigenous residents needed to sell parcels of land to pay their debts. Indigenous people often sold parcels to English settlers from the surrounding towns because English settlers could afford to buy land. Many Natick residents could no longer afford to keep their land because their options for employment were limited to dangerous, low-paying, and often temporary jobs such as military service. When men could find work, they were often away from their families for a significant period. Women sold homemade baskets, brooms, and traditional medicine, and children often lived in English households as unpaid indentured servants. Colonial circumstances frequently separated family units and physically removed individuals and families from their land. Any setback or tragedy, such as illness, injury, or loss of a family member, could be financially catastrophic for Indigenous Natick residents due to loss of income, having to pay doctor bills, or having to pay a guardian to administer an estate. When an Indigenous person cannot pay their debt, their children became wards of the state under the guardian's custody. Many deeds contained the signatures and names of guardians. In 1745, when Natick became a parish, Indigenous residents lost their right to participate in town government, which further shifted the balance of power within the community. You will also notice, as the century went on, deeds increasingly described land sales between English settlers. These deeds also hint at changes in politics beyond Natick. Earlier deeds acknowledged the King of England and that Massachusetts was an English colony. Later deeds acknowledge when the United States became a republic. The exhibit also contains documents from other Massachusetts communities, which provide insight into how land sales differed, or maybe not, outside of Natick. Simultaneously, the deeds show us that even as important political changes took place, the system of buying and selling land remained largely the same in Natick. Look to the exhibit for a more in-depth historical context. And I want to really emphasize that viewing this deed, the 1739 deed, along with the other documents in this exhibit, helps to create a clearer picture of the complex factors that defined important aspects of life in 18th century Natick. And there's some really interesting things that you might come across when looking at these deeds. For instance, we have some famous signatures. So some documents contain famous names mentioned in the deeds, as well as marks and signatures of the various people who lived in Natick and who had a real impact in Natick and beyond. So some of these documents include the signatures or marks of the Indigenous proprietors, who were the descendants of some of Natick's earliest and most famous residents. Here we have the signature of Joseph Ephraim, who is a prominent political leader and deacon in Natick's church. Next, we have John Jones, who was a guardian to the Indigenous residents of Natick, and he was also the owner of the Elm Bank property in what was then Dedham, and was a noted map maker throughout southern New England and Maine. And his signature appears a lot on different documents and deeds. So these bottom two signatures actually are found on documents that don't pertain to land in Natick, but might have some impact on how we understand Natick's history. So we have Samuel Gookin. He was a descendant of Daniel Gookin, the 17th century Indian superintendent for Massachusetts Bay Colony, who frequently visited Natick, and he wrote a lot about Natick too. Samuel never lived in Natick, but it makes sense that somebody might want to donate documents affiliated with the Gookin family to the Natick Historical Society. And finally, we have a signature, which was probably the most surprising one that I could find. This is on a deed about land from Boston. And that's the signature of Peter Faneuil, who was a prosperous trader who made most of his money from the slave trade and built Faneuil Hall in Boston. So he was a witness to a land sale in Boston, and that's why his signature appears here. But it is unclear why or how this deed arrived in our collection. But still very interesting, especially now. It's a lot of discussion about Faneuil Hall's name. So how was this exhibit created? The creation of this exhibit was not too complicated. The deeds themselves were easily accessible in our collections. After retrieving the deeds from their filing cabinets in our old office at 207 Union Street, I reorganized them in a Hollinger box for storage in the museum. We later found a box of 18th century surveyor maps in the museum. Next, I began scanning them. I initially planned to use the flatbed scanner in the Natick History Museum, but quickly learned that it was not the right size. Luckily, my Samsung Galaxy S21 has a wonderful camera that is capable of taking high-quality scans. All images of documents from the Natick Historical Society and Morse Institute Library were taken using the scan function on my phone. And I know that some scans turned out better than others just because the scan function isn't always the best. So I will be rescanning some of the documents. Next, I analyzed their content, taking notes on each deed and sorting them into categories, i.e. deeds of sale approved by the Massachusetts General Court, etc. I began writing historical context and analysis that would later become the body of the exhibit. And to do so, I read and took notes on vital primary and secondary sources, all of which are now listed in the sources and further reading section of the exhibit. Meanwhile, I corresponded with staff members of the Morse Institute Library. Jen Belcher was incredibly helpful in getting this project off the ground and helping me make connections with other Morse staff members and people who could help with the technological and logistical aspects of creating an online exhibit. Skylar Selden gave me access to the documents in the Morse Institute Library's collection and answered my many, often repetitive questions about the location of documents. The biggest hurdle for me was all the computer stuff, essentially. I chose to use Omeka as the online hosting platform because it was an affordable option and I had some experience using it from the digital history class I took in grad school. I was eventually able to figure everything out, although I initially had some trouble figuring out how to add an exhibit as a plugin on the website, so like the most important part. But creating the exhibit itself involved a few primary steps. First, I created the website to host the exhibit. I had to upload each document as an individual item that included a description and metadata. From there, I added the exhibit plugin and created each section of the exhibit, adding images as I went. I had already written much of the exhibit in a Google document and copied and pasted the writing into the exhibit. I then made all of the land deeds and surveyor maps part of the exhibit. Eventually, after a lot of editing and some helpful feedback from Nikki Lefebvre, Terry Evans, and Fran Weiss, I felt that the exhibit was ready to share on the Natick Historical Society website and our social media pages, and with everybody here today. So what's next? As the Natick Historical Society continues to reorganize and sort through our archival and other collections materials, we will inevitably find other relevant documents or objects that could enrich this exhibit. We are also beginning the process of transcribing the NHS's deeds. All transcriptions will be uploaded to the exhibit in the future, making the deeds more accessible as the contents of the documents will be much more legible. As you will likely notice, the deeds are very difficult to interpret, and it is hard to imagine the property boundaries within present-day Natick. The boundary markers and descriptions made a lot of sense to 18th century Natick residents, but are largely incomprehensible to us today. Further research will need to be done to find the locations of the parcels of land. Although we've relied on the Indian landholding maps, which is showed on the right of this slide, as a source of information, we are unsure of the map's history, who made it, and with what sources. I was recently informed that there are two slightly different versions of this map. The next step is understanding why the two differ and which one, if either, is more accurate. This exhibit focuses on land and the complex socio-political structures that governed and sometimes dictated its use. We have other documents in our collections that highlight other important themes, such as religion and labor. Although not as abundant in number, our documents about the 18th century church and free, unfree, and indentured labor in Natick are worthy of separate exhibits. They can contribute further nuanced conversation that will likely also tie back to land deeds. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Gail. I learn something new every time you talk about the deeds, so thank you. I think I also want to thank all of you for joining us today on what is a very busy Sunday, and it's gray but nice outside, so lovely to have you for a little bit of time here this afternoon. I think we will now open it up to conversation and questions. So you're welcome to do this in a couple of different ways. You can send something to me through the chat, and I will make sure Gail gets the question, or you can go ahead and raise your hand, use the raise hand function, or we're a small enough group that if you'd like to sort of unmute and just go ahead and ask your question, you should feel free to do that as well. Any questions to get us started? I do have one through the chat here, which is Gail, do you have a favorite deed that you came across that was most interesting to you, or maybe it's the one you chose to highlight, but was there any one deed that sort of stood out to you as particularly interesting?
I don't know. I think they're all interesting in their own way. I was particularly drawn to the deeds that demonstrated land sales between Indigenous people, because I think that's something that's often overlooked, is that there was this system in place so that Indigenous people could keep their land and exchange it amongst each other. So that's also why I chose the John George and Abraham Speen deed to demonstrate that. A really cool source that I was able to access through the Morse Institute Library was the proprietor's record book. So when they first came up with the proprietor system, they have this book of records essentially describing who became a proprietor and how many acres of land that they were assigned and where those acres were. So that was something really cool to see. And especially since that was a bound volume of records, it wasn't just like pieces of paper that happened to be donated and we can kind of assemble into a collection. It was something that had been together since it was written, and that was a really cool thing to see.
That's wonderful. You never know what you're going to find when you head into the archives, right? That's what makes this work so exciting. So I do have a hand raised. Doug and Sarah, Hannah, do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Actually, I had put the question in the chat. It just, is there a high-res version of the map available? And if so, or can we download and print it? It looks fascinating.
Yeah, so you actually can't download images off of the exhibit website, which is kind of a bummer about the exhibit. That's just the thing with Omeka. But we do have copies of the map for sale at the Natick Historical Society. We could also email you a higher resolution image if you are interested. You can reach out to us through our website and we can send it to you that way.
Thank you. I'm more than happy to buy one. That's fantastic.
Well, thank you.
And I just want to say, Gail, thank you for this presentation. As a person who just started working on the transcriptions already, I feel like I understand a lot about them because I saw, some of the things you're talking about. So thank you. That really helps put it in context.
Oh, and thank you. And thanks so much for volunteering to transcribe the deeds, because we know that cool. It's
very cool. I really like it.
It's interesting, but it can be tedious. So thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. We're very excited about that project. And so, Gail, I have a couple other questions here. When you were going through the deeds, did you see any good examples of sort of governmental stamps or seals on them?
Yeah, so some of them had seals. Not a lot of them. I think just over time, like they disintegrated and fell off. So a lot of old documents don't have seals on them anymore, but we do have a few that do. I know the surveyor's maps, they actually have watermarks in the paper. So you can see that these were like official government issued types of maps. So that's pretty cool to see. When I was taking pictures of the surveyor's maps, I was trying to do it in a way so that there was light coming up from behind so that you could see the watermarks. I don't know if it really translated into the exhibit, but if any of you are interested in ever like coming in and seeing these documents and holding these documents, you can always make an appointment to do so, and we'd be very happy to show you and point out some of the things that you might not be able to see online, but you can see in person.
So our interested person is very excited to know that there are watermarks on some of the documents and would certainly be interested in coming in. So please do go ahead and you can email Gail at, is it G. Coughlin?
Yeah, G. Coughlin.
NatickHistoricalSociety.org, or you can send a message to our general email, contact@NatickHistoricalSociety.org if that's easier to remember, and we'll get to you. So I think a related question is sort of connecting to the physical presence of the documents and preservation is, can you say anything about the condition or the preservation of the deeds, in particular the Scotch tape, question mark?
Oh yeah. So the physical condition of the deeds really varies. So most of these deeds came to us, to the Natick Historical Society in the 1930s. Most of the deeds from the Morse Institute Library are actually facsimiles. So it's not like the original deed itself, but it's a copy, like a high quality copy of the deed. So the original copies that we have at the Natick Historical Society, it really varies. And I think a lot of it just has to do with like the history of the deed itself, the physical object, a lot of which we can't trace. But the reason why we have so many from that mention Hezekiah Broad and his family. So there's two Hezekiah Broads, senior and junior. I should mention that. But their descendant, Curtis Broad, donated like 30 deeds in 1934. So most of them come from him. Even amongst those, there's a lot of variables in how they were, their condition today. So the Scotch tape is interesting. So when these deeds first came to the Natick Historical Society, it was commonplace to like hold old documents together with Scotch tape. And the reason why they had to be held together in the first place is because they had been folded so many times that they were falling apart at the seams of the fold. They weren't ripped, but the Scotch tape, it was something that was commonly used by archivists back in like the 1930s. But now we know that that actually damages the deeds. So one of the goals with this exhibit is that we have these digital copies of these physical objects, essentially.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think it's something kind of interesting to see that preservation method, which, you know, today looking back, we just, oh, pumped a forehead. Why did they do that, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, we only know what we know, and preservation techniques have changed considerably in the last 100 years. And thank goodness we have some of these documents that survive in whatever condition they happen to meet us in. So I also have, Gail, here a question that gets a bit beyond the 18th century. Where did it go, that question? Can you say anything about sort of the landmarks and the deeds, which I always find fascinating to hear, right? From this lump of stones to that apple tree to this little, you know, turn in the ground. Do you have any sense of sort of when that method changed and when property markers that we might see today, used today, became more common? And maybe it's fairer to ask, you know, this sort of same method lasts through the 18th century, or have you seen anything that looks different or would look more recognizable to us in your work?
Yeah, so all of the deeds that I've seen from the 18th century, they use a very similar system of describing things with like local natural landmarks, property boundaries of like the neighboring properties. I don't know when that changed. We do have deeds from the 19th century that I just haven't really gone through yet, and maybe somewhere down the line we could add it to this exhibit or create like a part 2 19th century edition. But I'm not quite sure when that changed. But if you read modern day deeds, you can find them on like the Middlesex County Register of Deeds online. And you look up like a property, like the house that you live in today, and look at the series of deeds going back to like the 1950s. The language is surprisingly similar. So like the boundary markers aren't similar, but the language is. So to me, that demonstrates that a lot of these practices surrounding describing land and property boundaries haven't really changed. So I think that's pretty interesting, but describing them with like the physical natural markers and stuff like that, I'm not sure, but I'll look into it, definitely.
It's a great question. And one last question here, I think, Gail, were all of the deeds that you encountered written in English, and could one find deeds in an Algonquin language?
That's a really good question. So everything that I saw was written in English. I'm not sure within the context of Natick if you'd be able to find them written in an Algonquin language, because I know that by the time this land system was adopted within the town, it was more common for even the Indigenous people in the town government to be writing in English. I know that they were still writing in their Algonquin language, but it was becoming more common for them to write in English. So I'm not quite sure. There are other deeds that the Natick Historical Society in the Morse Institute Library simply don't have because they just were never donated to us. So there are more deeds at the town clerk's office. The Middlesex County Registry of Deeds has stuff going back to the 1700s that just haven't been digitized, so you can't search them. So it's possible within those there's something, but nothing that I saw is in an Algonquin language.
Great, thank you. So I think just a couple more questions that came in here, if we're okay for just 2 more minutes.
Oh yeah.
So I've got, so in legal terms, Gail, who represented Indigenous people as witnesses? Was it, was anyone allowed to be a witness regardless of, I think, their status as Indigenous versus English or later American? Who could qualify to witness a legal transaction in this context?
Yeah, so a witness could be anybody. It could be an Indigenous male or female, English male or female. Oftentimes the witnesses were their neighbors, so they'd be mentioned in the deed as having a property adjacent to the property that was just purchased, and then they would also act as witness on the deed. So it could really be anybody.
Great, thank you. And I think Doug and Sarah Hannah, I think I see a hand raised again there. So go ahead and unmute yourself.
So not a question, but a comment. You mentioned deeds in the town clerk's office. I haven't actually gone and looked at this myself, but I'm a member of town meeting, and I know over the years we have appropriated a substantial amount of money for the town clerk's office to preserve old documents. So I'm assume that out of that process, there probably is some way to look at them. As I say, I haven't tried it myself, but I know that the town has made a substantial outlay to try to preserve the town clerk's records.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think
it's really good to hear.
Witness some of that.
Yeah, some of it.
When you've done research there, it's very well organized.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like there's more to do here, Gail. Lots of excellent questions and more to continue thinking about. And as you know, sort of more deeds to sort of seek out. And if anyone knows of a longtime Natick resident with important deeds up in their attic, please encourage them to donate them to the Natick Historical Society. And I think also please tell your neighbors and colleagues and friends in Natick if they are interested in looking into the early history of their land. This is a wonderful resource for beginning to understand not just the boundaries or the physical location of that land, but names that may be associated with it and understanding the context of those transactions. So I think with that, we will extend our heartfelt gratitude to Gail for all of her work. The exhibit is tremendous. I am so grateful to you. As you know, Gail, I can't say enough for all the work that you've done on this. And Gail will still continue doing programs on Natick's early history. So please check our website. And if you plan on delving into the exhibit more, we'll try to get this recording up online in the next week or two, so you can sort of use it as a companion piece to help navigate and learn some more about how to read these wonderful deeds. Thank you, Gail, and many thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming.